Hello everybody, and welcome to our Govern With webinar, first of our series for 2023, the role of the board in attracting and engaging workforce or talent. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I come from, and I'm sure you all come from many other lands, but the land I come from today is Wadawurrung. And I want to pay my respects to the elders past and present, and I extend respect to Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders who are actually present with us today. I want to particularly welcome our special guest today, Tracy, and I'll do that in a moment, but I'd just like to start with a little bit of housekeeping. Tracy and I are going to have a wonderful discussion. Please don't hesitate to put in questions, but we're going to take questions at the end, and then we're going to have a little 5 minutes at the very end of some special information for you all. That won't be in the recording, and we're going to encourage you to follow up with a link with Wes after our session today. So Tracy, very big welcome to you, and thank you so much for being our special guest today.
Absolute pleasure.
Tracy is the founder and CEO of Australian Public Affairs. Tracy has a 30-year history in advisory roles with a background in journalism and politics, which is fantastic. Tracy has worked with over 450 independent schools and school associations across Australia, but that's not the only area that Tracy works. Tracy also has an extensive practice in aged care, health, human services, government boards and not-for-profits. And Tracy's skills are extensive in governance, managing and helping with reputation risk. That's a pretty good one, Tracy. Marketing research, reputation building and issues management. And Tracy is also a director herself of the Association of Independent Schools New South Wales and Knox Grammar School in Sydney. So Tracy, I also have had the absolute pleasure and privilege of working with you for quite a long time. And I really am excited about having you here today with us and just the incredible insights and thoughts that you're going to give us as we go through our discussion today about workforce. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So our agenda today, it's not a bad idea to actually explain what does workforce mean. We throw around these terms and discussions, but I think it's going to be really important, and I'm going to go through that with Tracy in a minute. And we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about the right workforce attraction, engagement and retention strategies, particularly relating to leading a contemporary environmental social governance culture for that crucial retention piece. So before I start with Tracy's explanation of what is workforce and why is that an issue for boards now, I want to give everyone a little bit of insight into what are the top risks in 2023. And they are not just the top risks in health, human services, they seem to be across the board, no matter what sector we work in. And Tracy and I have the privilege of working with Aon, and Aon work with over 600 independent schools across Australia. And they do a risk report every second year. And in 2022, their risk report highlighted the top risks that executives and boards identified. And there'll be no surprises here for any of you. But it's really good to know that this is across the board, which is why we're talking about this today. Number one, ability to attract and retain talented staff, including succession planning. In other words, we have great people here. What are we going to do in the future? Cyber threat, for example, hacking, ransomware, malware, social engineering, and so on. Mental health of our workforce. So those of us who have a workforce, it's looking after them. COVID, we cannot forget, and we mustn't forget the impact of this pandemic and what's going to happen in the future and what's going to happen from a public health perspective. And last but not least, safety. Safety is such an important one, and we're not just talking about environmental, physical safety. We're talking about people's genuine human safety. So Tracy, welcome again. And
Thank you.
help us understand why workforce is so important for our boards now.
Look, I think historically workforce has been staffing. It has been about putting people in positions to do certain tasks. And I think there have been three changes here that affect a board and affect governance. The first is that there is a workforce shortage. It doesn't matter whether you're aged care, education, health, it doesn't matter which sector you're in, mining, energy, resources, it doesn't matter. There is a workforce shortage. And that means that where people work, how long they work for and what they do and who they want to associate with in their working life is taken out of the hands of what was an operational matter. Now, for boards, a shortage of workforce is an issue. Equally, the rise in the importance of culture is a real issue, because culture is about who wants to work with who. It is about the environment. It is about turnover. It is about competing. And increasingly, culture is an element of competition for organisations. And I guess the third one is, and we've seen it in the newspapers this morning out of Queensland, that psychological safety is actually very, very important. And you're starting to get, in a post-COVID environment and the increase in mental health questions and issues and challenges, you're starting to see this become a governance issue because it's a risk. So the combination of having to find a workforce, having to attract them and keep them, and lastly, I guess, having to make sure that they are safe and you meet all of those requirements as an employer, has meant that it's not a staffing question anymore. It's actually a strategic governance question, because it is about your ability to be sustainable, your ability to do what you do into the future. And so increasingly, I see that boards are getting involved in the workforce question. How large the organisation is depends on how much into the weeds they tend to get, but certainly it is now a governance question.
No, I would 100% agree with you, and I certainly agree that this is a big risk. And I think, Tracy, you and I have seen over the years, anything that's suddenly a new emerging risk does take the board into we better find out what's happening operationally. I think you and I have seen that certainly across aged care and health with clinical governance. Remember 2017, all of a sudden that was the number one thing on the table, and boards had to get down and get right in and understand what that meant on a day-to-day business.
And I don't think it's just COVID and the sort of increasing requirements around that. I think community expectations have changed.
Yes, yes.
Certainly, a job interview these days will always include the question, how flexible are you? That never used to happen before, and it's because employers are not in the box seat. But it is, expectations have changed, and that's expectations of people who work for you, but also expectations of your broader audience. So consumers, customers, clients, they want to see that you're active in this space, and they want to see that as a governance question, this is covered and is well thought through.
No, I think you're right, and that's very, very true. So, Tracy, I think if we follow on from the themes in the report from Aon, their risk report, they really did talk about the need for innovative strategies and the need for that to start at the top. I think they talked about we need to actually be more innovative in our approaches for recruiting and retaining talent or workforce. And I love this notion of working towards creating an environment that's sticky. So that means, wanting people to stay. It's really true. So I love this. It's choices and actions by school boards, but this is all boards, and leaders must clearly demonstrate how much their teachers and staff are valued. And I love this notion. It's about, what do we need to do to make people feel valued, and what do people measure us by for achieving that value now? And it's absolutely fascinating, Tracy, because in our work, we've actually we have actually included some new questions since 2021 on our governance, both board governance review questionnaire and also our skills matrix questionnaire. And it's absolutely fascinating how it's shining a light on an area that is very relevant to our ability to attract and retain workforce. And it is around the areas that the boards feel they know the least about, even if their organisation is doing things, and also about their own skills. Now, interestingly, and of no surprise to anyone, the area that had the lowest results. So this is based on our last 6 months' work, Tracy, and this is based on the feedback from now over 600 directors. Basically, they all feel that probably the area where they have the least skills is ICT strategy and governance, a whopping 27% out of 100. But of interest is where we ask the question about environmental social governance skills, or what are you doing in your organisation? Even though it wasn't the lowest score, it actually came back in the 30%. So it does highlight that this is an area where we do need to become more aware and understand how it impacts on our future attraction and retention strategies. Now, I think it's really important to define what we mean by ESG, because that is thrown around quite a lot. But for the purpose of the feedback that we've got and how this impacts on Tracy's and my discussion today, it's really important to realise that the E stands for environmental. Now, that is not just climate change, because you get so often people saying, well, what on earth does climate change have to do with our business? It's actually about environmental issues, and it's about what you're doing about environmental issues. All of us who are in an organisation have what we call a footprint, and this is a fabulous way of describing these two elements. So the environmental issues is our footprint. How do we manage? What do we do about our footprint? The second element is the social side of things, and I love the description that it's about our handprint. And that is all about our people issues, which is what you and I are talking about today. It's about our social inclusion, policies and procedures and the way we do it. It's about gender equity. It's about people. It's about culture. It's about safety. It's about our handprint. And the amazing person who taught me about this, who is the chair of Dairy Safe Victoria, Anne, she taught me that when she goes overseas, when companies meet you and talk to you and present themselves, invariably in their second slide, they have a comment about what is their strategy for managing their footprint and how do they manage their handprint. And that's impressive, and that's something that we could move towards a little bit more, I think. So our results showed us that environmental social governance capabilities as an individual and within our boards does create a disproportionately impactful risk. And when we burrow down and talk to staff and people who work in organisations, one of the biggest things that they are feeding back is their dissatisfaction with hypocrisy. So that is, they're attracted to organisations by the values, by the purpose, by what they say they're doing, Tracy, and then they discover, wait a minute, this isn't anything like what it's like. And how could boards make decisions like that when your values look like that? And so that disenfranchises workforce. So I guess there's a lot to think about when we think about our innovative attraction, engagement and retention strategies moving forward. So Tracy, yeah, let's have a think about the handprint. Yeah, I'd love your comments on that.
I might jump in for a second there. The really important thing, I think, is to really understand your audiences. And if we're talking about it from a governance perspective, you will get the CEO's report. You will know how many staff, how long they've stayed, what they said on the way out. But it actually has to be much, much deeper than that. You need to understand why they're attracted to your organisation, what keeps them there, and when they go, what are the common trends for the reason they go? What, not just the statistics around time frame. So that is interesting for a board, because usually that would have been an operational question, as I said before, but it is now something that the board needs to engage with, because you need to pick trends early. And trends these days in workforce can become very public and can really damage the organisation's reputation, which I guess if you look at the sort of not-for-profit sector or the charity sector, you start to see a drop in philanthropy, you start to see fewer volunteers, you start to see government grants drying up. There is a whole range of consequence around reputation, and the handprint that you have is very important for that reputation. So if I think of some sectors, if I take, say, the independent school sector, which refers directly to the Aon survey, there are some difficult to find staff. If you take science staff, physics teachers, maths teachers, and the way schools competed was to just increase the salary. I think you've got to be more innovative than that. You actually have to think outside the box, because you are competing with an increasing number of organisations for a smaller workforce. And that is that governance question, but it goes right the way through culture, because you have to not only get them there, you have to keep them there. And what does that extra year on their CV, or the extra 2 or 3 years on their CV mean? And then when they leave, you need to know why, so you can stop the flow. Very much more than ever, I think employment is a partnership, not just with management, but is also a partnership with the board. And if you don't align the values, if you don't align the processes, the behaviour, the culture, the promises, and keeping them there, and the way they are treated and appreciated, then you'll very quickly find you'll have no workforce, and you may not have any of those supplementary stakeholders, because they will also vote with their feet.
Tracy, you're so right, and I think that speaks to that acute need now of boards not being afraid to ask for what is the culture of our staff, how engaged are they in safety, quality, those sorts of things. And it's interesting, because if I think about our surveys, Tracy, across across health, across human services, there is a question that asks about the amount of information the board receives and how much, and it's one of the lowest areas. We haven't quite worked out how to do that yet.
Yeah, and I have a number of clients telling me that they are looking at all sorts of things, from how many days do you want to work from home? Do you need support for further professional development or study? Do you need time off for families? Would it help if you got 5 weeks holiday a year instead of 4 weeks, so that you could spend more time during those school holiday periods? So there's a whole lot of really innovative questions being asked. Now, the board's role is to spark that discussion and to set the parameters, but equally to monitor it. You don't want half your workforce working 4 days a week. You don't want all of your workforce working from home. So there are some parameters around there which do have that governance element.
I think that's really true. And Tracy, something else that I've been learning lately that I had never thought about before is that there's a significant difference between attraction, engagement, and retention in a strategy.
Yeah. How many management sit down and say, okay, it's January, what do you need for professionally to keep you here in partnership for another 12 months? And that's a really interesting question, because it's not a pay rise question. No. And very rarely does pay rise seem to come up when you ask that question. It really is that partnership idea that I was talking about, that if there's not give and take, and there's not that partnership and that mutual respect and appreciation, then you will find you cannot recruit fast enough in a tightening labour market. You cannot recruit fast enough to plug the gaps, let alone expand, or let alone do something differently.
Exactly. And I think one of the things that I'm observing is that when we look at health, for example, and aged care, the enormous workloads on our staff and our management, it's just killing. And it's very easy to overlook a lot of the strategies that we may have had in place about the engagement piece. I think it's the engagement piece that we probably have been overlooking a lot, because you know, simple things like even doing people's reviews, actually people love feedback. Are you finding that too, that there just isn't the time to do what we're meant to do?
And aged care is a really, really good example, because there aren't the number of people, what is it, hundreds of thousands of extra people are needed for aged care over the next 5 years. Well, you can't find them in the existing market. So how do you appeal for those that are working in tangential markets? And how do you keep them when they get to this new sector? And increasingly, particularly in aged care, I'm seeing that technology provides part of the answer. And that's not an obvious solution, because you would think, well, how's that working? Well, it's working because technology can do the bottom end of the business. Technology can do the paperwork, the reporting, some of those things, so that the nurses and the more professional staff don't have to worry about the bottom end. And you minimize that sort of human error by using technology and automated systems. So it is, yes, it's enough to attract them, but you're right. How do you keep them? And how do you, in a sector like aged care, say, well, I'm a better person for you to go with than the other aged care providers? And how do you attract people that have never worked in the sector but have a natural ability there? So it is attraction, but if they're walking out the door faster than they're walking in, you have a real problem. And the only way to do that is through that engagement and through actually really knowing them. What do they value? What do they want? Why are they there? And I guess over the years, you know, we've all heard it's because of the values. Faith-based organisations probably have a little bit of advantage there, in the sense that the values are actually worn on the sleeve and they are practiced and they are built in. But for some other organisations, how do you balance those commercial imperatives and that commercial need with the idea that you must have values, you must show that you care about your footprint, you must show that you're investing in staff? How do you balance those two in workplaces where commercially they're challenged?
Yeah, exactly. And look, I think that, you know, what you were saying brings up another really good point, is, and this speaks to the journalist in you, which is about investing in how you look. And yeah, it's sort of that combination of word of mouth. Nothing gets around quicker in the ether than whether that's a good place to work for or not. But likewise, I am constantly surprised by my own children who tell me, you can tell in 20 seconds whether an organisation is legit about its footprint and handprint policies, and whether or not they really are worth working for.
And as those born at sort of the turn of the century start to enter the workforce, they have a very different approach to a job interview. They Google, they look for ratings, they read customer reviews, they do all sorts of things. They read annual reports. They really comb the web before they turn up for the interview. And it makes me laugh, because the idea of, well, do you have any questions for us, which is a standard interview question, the answer these days when you're talking to young people is usually, no, I've been able to research it. So you can't have a policy in secret, as you've said, and equally, you have to do more than just have the policy. There has to be and yes, you're right, this appeals to the journalism in me, that the content has to be there that actually demonstrates in an online environment that you genuinely care. It's not a policy or a piece of paper that sits at the bottom of the website, or that people are given as part of their induction package. It is actually what you live and breathe on a daily basis, and there are people willing to talk about that and willing to rank that highly. That's what they're looking for. So the idea of the sort of online content has become a much more curated and strategic environment than perhaps it used to be, because it does feed into the whole governance questions around attracting and retaining staff.
And look, it does also speak to the things that we probably have overlooked, that we could promote, that does attract staff. Like some of our rural and regional organisations have some of the most beautiful communities. They do such environmental things, and people are really drawn to those sorts of opportunities, places to live. But it's about taking the time to understand what is it about where we are that we can use to attract people. And it's a big job, I know.
It is. It's interesting. As I watch the journalism market shrink, you start to see journalists appear as in-house content people, and that's
really,
exactly
yeah,
what they're doing.
Yes.
And somebody said to me the other day, I do more journalism now than I ever did as a journalist, because you're finding those examples, you're promoting those examples, you're tapping into really knowing your audience and what is it they value. That's what you're echoing in the content.
Exactly, and that really does speak to the kinds of skills on the board too, which is exciting. More, contemporary kind of skills, more interesting skills. Yeah. And another thing that, Tracy, I know you and I have talked about, and I'm really interested in your thoughts about this as well, is you started to talk about it earlier. It's that allocation of resources and finance. And you said traditionally it was just thrown at, okay, if we need more staff, let's get them a better wage. But there's a real trend starting to happen in service provider organisations such as health, schools, aged care. And that is, how can the organisation help the staff member or the workforce by actually making having better resources for the people they look after?
Which is an important question. Nobody really wants to do the hard yards in their job every day. And if they see their friends in similar positions in other organisations that don't have to do that because the technology's there, or don't have to do that because there is an office junior, or there is somebody there who can take that burden away and allow them to focus on what they want to focus on. And certainly you hear those arguments from the nursing sector, for instance. It is a point of distinction. It gives you the competitive edge as you're chasing that diminishing workforce. So it's not something to be ignored, and I think leaving it at an operational level sells it short.
Yeah, no, exactly. I know that a lot of staff, when you talk to them, there is so much expectation on their shoulders from community, from the carers, from everybody else. It's not just their KPIs of their job, it's that all those other eyes watching them. And I think that's where it's not about their own wage, it's about how can you help me meet this expectation. I think that's a really important one.
I think all of us want to feel good at the end of the day, and we want to feel that we've contributed and added something. And I think that whole idea around sort of meaning and purpose in your job and in your employment is probably more critical in times where mental health is getting more challenging.
Yes.
The theory's been around for a long time, but how do you elevate that to the governance level, I think, is one of the keys to giving yourself that point of difference.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely. And to continue on with our looking at, innovative and sort of good ideas around handprint, there's also a big discussion about having visible pathways and opportunities available. Now, Tracy, there's a traditional perspective on this, and that is that a lot of smaller organisations say to me, don't be ridiculous, we can't have visible career pathways because there is nowhere else to go. But I think the interpretation of that is different nowadays. And one of the key things that I've heard about that I think is fantastic, it's about understanding from your staff and from staff who leave what part of their pathway is your organisation going to be used for. And it's about being okay about that. So I've heard some good examples of organisations who go, you know what, I understand that we're a stepping stone, but not getting all funny about that. A stepping stone for directors, a stepping stone for careers. And once you come to terms with something like that, becoming the best at that stepping stone. Have you heard of, examples of that as well?
Yeah, I'll give you an example from the other day. A head of an independent school said to me that the staff turnover in the executive is a little bit higher than it usually is because the three people who were the sort of three deputies, they were in charge of different areas, have been offered headship jobs at other schools. What a fantastic progression for them. And she said to me she was absolutely delighted that she had been able to provide the stepping stone. And when they came in on the job interview, she actually asked them, where does the career go? And they said, well, in 5 years, I would like to be the head of a school. And so she facilitated that. And what happened was when she started to advertise those jobs, hundreds of people were applying because that was part of the stepping stone where they wanted to go.
Isn't that great?
So she's attracting these people and being realistic and saying it'll be 5 years or it'll be whatever before you get there. Here are the skills you need. I know because I'm there and I've done it before. This is what we're going to work for. This is the career progression. Now that's just one example in a school, but I think it's a very interesting example that on the traditional face of things, you would go, 3 members of the executive have left. What is wrong? What is going on there?
But you wanted that.
Yeah, but she's celebrating it and is holding it for what it is. So I think there is, talking about thinking creatively, I think the other side is really knowing who these people are when you hire them. And gone are the days, I think, where you say, here is my checklist of the things I need you to do. Can you do all of those? Tick, you're employed. You actually need a few gaps in those ticks. Yeah. And you need people to come on board as part of that sort of partnership journey where they're learning and they're contributing. And it's going to mean for management a lot more patience. But if you do it right, you end up like the head of that independent school where you are inundated with really good people that want to work with you on the stepping stone.
Exactly. It's amazing how that transparency, that truth, I having grown up and most of my career has been in that regional and rural areas. You are a fabulous movement point, stepping stone or on people's journey. And I think just embracing that is a really smart idea. The other thing that I've heard a lot about is also realizing I may not have the skills or we may not be able to support people's, career passions around their studies. But there's a real focus on partnerships and collaborations now and working with those to provide that mentorship and support while these people are working with you on their journey.
I've certainly seen that around sort of academic institutions as well as big employers. Marrying that up. So in some way, the job is slightly different, but it advances the person and it causes them to sort of double down and give more.
No, I agree. So I think there's some really fabulous examples that we can translate from sector to sector. Now, another really important area is our footprint and, being seen to be taking care of our environmental footprint. And I know, of course, this is something you're very passionate about, but I know it's a really big one for making staff feel engaged in that engagement piece and wanting to stay and do something.
I was talking to a client the other day whose staff wanted a sort of recycling unit for toners from printers, and they'd always resisted it because the space it took up and there was this pile of rubbish there. Anyway, worked out a way of doing it, and staff are involved in a recycling program. And as a result, they're very enthusiastic and they've linked it to internships. They've linked it to a sort of competition within the office between different divisions. And it's actually a small thing like a recycling program has actually become part of the sort of culture and the social aspects of working there because they're in teams against each other and they feel like they're doing that for something good.
No, it's fantastic. Again, it's about taking the time in these incredibly busy work environments. And instead of thinking, oh gosh, we don't even have enough people for our roster, it's okay, we do. And that, long term, if we still allow people to be involved in these things. It's really, really important. The other thing that I also have learned is that a lot of organisations say we're too small, or we don't have big environmental projects, or we're not in the right place. But one of the other things I've seen is don't invent something yourself for the sake of it. Proudly promote that you actually support the partner's project, and that your staff might even be allowed to have some time each month with one of your key partners to help with whatever they're doing, because you can't all have a project going.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I've got a very good example of that close to home. Australian Public Affairs, my firm, where we've got 20 people, kind of big, kind of not big, big for our industry, but not big compared to most organisations. Do we have the resources to invest in a project? Probably not, but we have a partnership with the International Justice Mission, which is about calling out and resolving modern slavery. And our people get to move through there and spend a day or two a week over a period of time, depending on what skills and what services that organisation needs. And what it means is we've been able to contribute professionally at no cost to us, particularly other than the staff member is there, but it's moved through the office. So a common discussion in the office is around modern slavery, is around the legislation passing through Parliament, is around this area of interest that is a shared area of interest in quite a diverse workplace. So it hasn't taken resources, and I know I hear this from particularly in the not-for-profit sector, but we only have 3 people here. What can we possibly do? Think about that partnership idea, because it is a game changer in terms of culture. It is a game changer in terms of people being invested. And really understanding what it's like, in our case, to go and sit in with a client or sit in with another organisation and look back at your own organisation. So it's proved to be quite valuable.
No, exactly. Tracy, we've got a lot of really good questions, a lot of comments and thoughts. So I think it might be a really good time to actually open up with some of those questions. And I want to thank everybody for putting in questions. And hopefully I can ask Tracy those questions. And if we don't ask all of your questions today will certainly come back to you. So I think people agree that some people don't know how to, or they're scared to engage or give their feedback. Do you have any, this is from Richard. Richard's wondering, do you have any supports or ideas? This is with cultural, literal, or even physical things that create people's fear to actually give the feedback, because they're scared of, the other side of this is losing their job or being troublesome or seen as troublesome.
Yeah, it's look, it comes down to knowing your staff, and one size doesn't fit all. So there's not, unless you've only got one staff member, I guess. There's no one size for everybody. So if you know your staff, regardless of whether there are cultural differences, whether there are literacy differences, they will know what makes them feel good. They will know what's possible because they know your organisation. Get a range of ideas from them, because then they own it. And Richard, I also note your comment there that staff leave because of burnout.
Yeah.
I think that is part of workforce retention, and a really important part of the board's role and the governance role is to find out who hasn't had a holiday for a while, who needs a break, who is seeking assistance through an EAP, or who has actually spoken to their boss that I'm tired, I'm having trouble, I've worked nonstop during COVID, I now need a break, I haven't had a break in 3 years. How is that question actually being managed? Because that is, you're right, that is the key retention question. And it is, again, different for everybody. But if you don't recognise it's an issue, you can't solve that issue.
I couldn't agree with you more, Tracy. I actually heard a fabulous idea from a group of directors when I was talking to them a while ago, and they were talking about the humdrum of the role. I mean, there might be very high-powered, fabulous roles like being a radiologist or or being a specialist theatre person or theatre nurse or whatever. But at the end of the day, the roles are very hard, and just sitting inside reading these things every day, reading the reports, and you don't see daylight almost. It's about actually offering them the opportunity that is what you've employed them for, but maybe one day a week or one day a month doing something else, actually trying to understand the mental torture that comes with that rinse and repeat, even though it's a very high functioning job. That can, my husband, who's a doctor, will often say, just being inside four walls and talking to people all day can be exhausting. And so it's thinking about how do we move that around. I know it can be difficult, but it's a really good idea, I think. Give people another role to do. Bernie has said the board, as direction settlers and monitors of organisational health across cycles, is increasingly dynamic. He's absolutely right. The roles are broadening. Susan has asked, what can a board do if the management team believes that workforce is an operational issue and not a board matter? Great question.
I've seen this so many times. It is spot on, and part of that is because traditionally it has been an operational issue, and the other is there is a very delicate relationship between the board and management. And I think if management feels that the board is unnecessarily interfering or is going to want to work out which of these candidates is best for that reception job, or which of these candidates should fill that role, that's a problem. But equally, the board should have a risk matrix. And I would really question the credibility of the risk matrix if it doesn't include workforce issues on it. And it's perhaps a question that is much higher up than the weeds, and it is about empowering the operational team to get the best people they possibly can. And that's the job of the board, because that is risk management. So it is about saying, here are the parameters of how you might bundle up an employment package. Here are the parameters on how you might keep somebody through professional development or through exposure to new ideas or new people. Here is where you can go with all of these, but allowing management the ability to pick and choose from those within parameters in order to get the person they want in that reception job, or they want in whatever position. So you're empowering them. You're not taking away from them or cutting across them or trying to do their job. And that's that delicate balance. It is easier in some organisations than others, but it very much needs to be a partnership between the management team and the board, because at any point, the risk matrix, everything on it will have a crossover between the management team and the board, and there needs to be a dialogue around that.
Yes, exactly. And I think that kind of speaks to Bernie's point, Tracy, about how are you making visible board fitness from the perspective of bright sparks industries need, and bold executives needed to shape the organisational future. So I think what Bernie's saying, and I agree, it's like these are new skills on both sides, and how are we making that happen? So it sort of follows on from what you were just talking about.
Yeah, it is about, as a director, growing and getting the new skills on the way through. And I know there are some sectors in some states where being on a board requires some mandatory professional development each year. Regardless of that, I think there should be some from any board. I've interpreted that question slightly differently, and it's about sort of making visible the board's fitness in these areas. And I'd have to say, historically, the board was sort of faceless people that sat in the background and did whatever they did that wasn't generally well known. But as you've started to see that more dynamic performance of boards and requirements on boards, I think the boards have become more present with the target audiences, and increasingly you see them listed on websites with CVs. You see them, they don't just appear in the annual report, and they don't sneak in after hours and have their board meeting. There is a lot more engagement between the board and not just management, but staff as well. And part of this needs to be profiling that professional development and making sure that if you've got a skills-based board, what are their skills and how are you developing those, and how are they contributing those to empower the organisation to do better, or to do more, or to have a greater impact, whatever is the objective.
Yeah, no, I would entirely agree. There is an opportunity here for broadening the kind of skills we need, and to look at some of the strategies you've talked about today. We definitely do need to have a different set of extra skills as well. So Richard's also just pointed out the need for more specific packages and support, particularly in those rural areas. And actually, Alicia, I think this is really good, has pointed out that she works with the department, and the comment on the care economy, which I think is a fabulous phrase. The care economy is looking to put increased focus on collaborative relationships, particularly in the regional services. Yeah. I think that's going to help.
Yeah, and that's certainly right in the midst of all the change at the moment. So it is an area that's up for contention. And you're right, in those rural, regional and remote areas, you need locals on the ground. It's not something you can't really care or manage care if you're not there, or at least have some sort of presence. So the idea that you might attract more people to that care economy by building on local relationships, and someone who might have 3 hours spare on a Tuesday might want to come in and help somebody locally. So it is all about those local relationships, and it is about building them, particularly in those regional areas where they don't have the staff on the ground. They don't have some of the capacities that the big cities have.
Exactly. So I think that would be a really good thing, for the partnerships to provide more than just technical help, more than just health help, to actually help with the care and attraction and retention of staff. I love that idea. Dennis, I don't know if you've read Dennis's point here. But Dennis. Yeah, it's a good point though, but it's a very good point what Dennis is talking about. And Dennis is pointing out the fancy asking boards to be more operational. And also he's pointing out that CEOs and executives have to become more invested in accountability for leading and delivering cultural change and operational outcomes conducive to this. And I would agree, but I think Tracy's and my point is very much that boards need to lead on the strategy piece. And that means that boards need to understand that this is a risk, and that they need to ask the question, because it's the questions that we ask and the strategies that we set at the board level that start the management and mitigation of risk. Because it's what drives activity. I mean, I'm really interested in your thoughts, Tracy, because I think Dennis has really summed it up well.
Yeah, I think if I've interpreted correctly there, that the answer, of course, can't be just to throw in technology, because if you gave an example of teachers, nurses, and doctors. Certainly, yes, there is a lot of administrative reporting, accountability, and most of that's a good thing, but sometimes when it bogs down, it takes away the joy of the job. So you'll hear teachers talk about teaching being a calling rather than a vocation, and because of that, the more you say you must teach to this formula, you must teach to only these outcomes and not outside this barrier, the more they lose that teaching. And it's interesting you say that technology isn't the only solution. I agree that technology is not the only solution, and you're right, some of those administrative roles and some of that structural change is needed around that. But it was interesting to watch during COVID that the idea that you could teach over online, over remote learning for a number of teachers actually brought back the joy of teaching. And so I think there is a role to play. It's not a simple fix, and I think you're right, there is structural change needed. I think there is regulatory change needed. I think in a lot of sectors there is accountability that goes in a database somewhere and isn't actually accountable for anything. And I think there is a lot of activity accountability rather than impact accountability, particularly when you look in some of those health and aged care and some of those human services. So I think it is multifaceted. And I think your point, Dennis, is well made, that you can't just throw technology at it. And sorry if I came across as that simplistic.
Katerina brings up a really good point. She said that workforce issues should provide themes about culture, retention, exit warnings, and the board should be aware of these and ask questions. It speaks to that well-informed questions that the board should ask. But they, as Dennis said, they should be strategic.
Yeah. And without knowing your audience, how do you know that the parameters you're giving as a board and the guidelines you're setting are actually relevant?
That's a really good point. It's a really good point. So in finishing, Tracy, I want to thank you so much for being our guest today. Your insights have been really valuable. I know that everyone's going to really love getting this recording and to be able to listen to those insights again. And thank you for being our first guest presenter this year and the beginning of our discussing this very important subject.
Thank you very much, Fi. It's been a pleasure to be here and talk through some of these issues, because it's and the questions have been great as well, because this is a really live topic at the moment, and I think there are a lot of boards grappling with the workforce issue and with ESG.
I would agree, and so I sincerely thank you. And I want to thank all of our amazing guests today, and we look forward to following up with you all. Thank you very much.